Hey guys, in this video review we're talking about variables again. This is the second of two videos talking about variables. If you haven't watched the first video, go back and watch that one before watching this one. This one is going to be a little bit longer because we're going to delve into variables at greater detail in this video. Before we start, I want to recap some of the things that we've discussed in the past. First, Python reads statements or instructions from the top down like a recipe. Spaces are very important. Variables names must start with a letter. Variable names can contain letters, numbers, and underscores. Variable names should be lowercase. These words cannot be variable names, and these are keywords or reserved words. And we discussed some of this in the first video. So variables are containers for storing data or values. They're stored in your computer's memory. They can be used and updated while your program runs. The assignment operator, or the equal sign, is used to set values. And here are some examples of variable assignments. Okay, I'm going to jump over to the Raspberry Pi to do a little bit of practice. I'm going to open up Thonny here instead of Mu for a practice. And we're going to save or open up the variables file that we worked on with the previous video. All right. So first, let's talk about data and value types inside of Python. So we touched on this a little bit in the first video, but I want to be very specific here. So there are a couple data types. First, we talk about integers, which is basically negative and positive whole numbers. You can set variables to integers. So I'm going to create a variable called changing var. And the first value that I'm going to set it to is the integer 23. Okay, and I'm going to put a lot of comments in this. Usually when I'm writing a program, I wouldn't put these many comments, but I want to make sure you guys are clear on what's going on here. So this variable points to an integer, and I'm going to print this out because I'm working here in script mode. If I were working in interactive mode, I wouldn't have to do this, but in script mode, setting this value to 23 is silent. So I want to print out the value of changing variable. I'm actually going to add 7 to it. So I'm adding to the integer variable. All right. Next, the next kind of data that we can save or value we can save is a floating point value or a decimal number to a variable. Okay, so I'm going to use the same variable name, changing var, and we're going to set it to 2.71828. And this variable points to a float. That's or now points to a float. That's the abbreviation for floating point number or decimal number. Okay. And similarly here, I'm going to print this out. I'm going to add to it and then print out. So I'm going to add 3.14159 to the value that changing var holds that I set in the previous line. And again, I'm adding a lot of comments here, but I just want to make sure that it's clear to you guys what's happening here. So I'm adding to a float, or adding to float variables. Okay? Next kind of data that we can save in a variable is a string. And I'm going to be talking about strings in a lot more detail in a later video. But in general, you just think of strings as letters or other text. There's a lot to talk about with strings, but that's another kind of data that you can save. So I'm just going to save or have changing variable point to the value of the letter A in the string. And I'm going to similarly use the print function here to print out the value inside of A, changing var rather, which is going to be A, and I'm going to add to it. Oh, actually, I need to add, I'm going to add to it. Oh, yeah, mistake here. I'm not adding a false, I'm adding a string to it, sorry. Adding, so I'm going to go BCD. So I'm going to add BCD to the string A, and I'm adding to a string variable, or adding to string variables. Okay, and the next we can say Boolean values or data to a variable. A Boolean value is basically just true or false, or you can think of it as 1 and 0. As we discussed in class, all computers speak in binary, so 1 and 0 is true and false, or on and off. Okay, so I'm going to set changing var to false, and now this variable points to a bool. And again, that's an abbreviation like float for Boolean. Okay, I'm going to print out this variable as well, changing var plus false. So I'm going to add false to a false, and you guys can think about what you think that should be when I run this program. So if you add a false to a false, what do you think it should be? I'm going to run now. Okay. All right. So the first changing var was 23. We added 7 to it, and we printed it out. We got 30. Then we changed it to a floating point number, and we added another floating point number to it and printed that out. We got that number. Then we changed it to a string, just the letter A, and then we added another string to it, and we got that, and we added two falses together. Now again, false is the same as 0, so we added 0 to 0, so 0 to 0 is 0. Okay? All right, so those are the main or the primitive data types inside of Python. We'll discuss more complex data structures later on, but I wanted to cover the main data types before going on to other topics in variables. So I want to go over the type function. So the type function it tells you what type of data that you're working with. So you see I used type to and typed in 300 rather, and I got it into int. You can also assign a variable and do the same thing. So I'm going to set this variable to hello, which is a string, and if I check the type, the type function will tell me that I got a string there. Okay. Now, if I set n to 3.14159, which is a float, if I do type, it tells me that it's a float. Okay, and this is the same variable. I'm just changing it. I'm just updating it using different data types or different values. Okay. If I set it to 3/5, it's a float again, because of that division. Okay, and if I set n to true, which is a bool, and then I check the type using the type function, it should tell me that it's a bool. Okay. I can set one more thing. I can set it to none, having no value, meaning that it has no type. Okay. Moving on from here, if I set n back to a floating point number, let's say pi again, let's set it to 3.14159 again, and you'll see that's what it's set to. And now that we're in interactive mode, I could just type the variable. Okay, so it's a float, right? I can change that float into an integer using the int function. So we changed that 3.14 into an integer. It just used the leading number. It's still a float. So if we want to actually set it to an integer, we have to save it as an integer. So n equals int n. So now n is a integer. Okay, and if we type in n, we get 3. All right. If I set n to 42, it's an integer. And if I check the type again, it should verify that. But I can change it into a floating point number by using the float function. Now that doesn't actually change the variable. The variable is still an int. If I want to change the variable, again, I have to save it or reassign it using the assignment operator. So I use float and n, and now n is a floating point number. If I check the type with the type function, I have a float again. Or I have a float now, rather. All right. 4.2, or sorry, 42.0. Okay. I can also set this to 45. Now 45 is a string because it's in quotation marks. So if I use the float function here, it'll change it to a float, and I can add to it. But again, it's not updating the n variable. I can also change it to an integer, and I can add to it. So if I add 5 to it, it'll add 5 to it. But because I did not update the variable, if I try to add to n itself without using the int function or the float function, I will get an error because n is still a string. So again, if I want to convert n into a integer or a float from being a string, I have to reassign it. So or I can add another string to it, like so. So if I add a string 5 to the string 54, it's just going to add a 5 to the end as opposed to doing addition. All right, I'm going to jump over to script mode and do a little work here. Delete what we had from our previous video. And we're going to talk about fancy variable assignments. So we already talked about how to assign things to a variable, assign values to a variable using the equal sign. And let's think about a situation where a teacher has a bunch of students in their in her class, and she wants to give all these students the same grade. You can actually assign a single value to multiple variables using this notation. Just have the variable name equal another variable name, have another variable name, and then at the end have the value. So I'm going to print out each one of the values, or sorry, each one of these variables, and you'll see when I run the program that each one of these variables, Dan grade, Joy grade, and Tom grade, will be equal to B, the string B. Let me just copy and paste here and make some changes. Joy, Tom, and Joy grade. Okay? So I'm going to run, and you'll see Dan's grade is a B, Joy's grade is a B, Tom's grade is a B, as you would expect. Again, that's a fancy assignment. You might not use that all that often, but I want you guys to know that that's a possibility within Python. Okay, let's think about another scenario where we might use fancy variable assignments. Let's think of if we were creating a game, and we had a player with a health and armor and strength. Sorry, and shield strength rather. And at the beginning of the game, we're going to set all of these values to 100. And that is an integer, and that's going to be important in a second, because as you remember, when we're setting all those values in the previous example, we were setting them all to the string B. All right, so I'm going to print this out similar to the what I printed out in the previous example. So I'm going to print out each one of these values. First, I'm going to print out the shield strength. So current player shield strength, and then P shield. I'm going to just copy and paste this a couple times and just edit it like I did before. Okay, change this to armor strength, and then change the variable over here to P armor, and change this to player health. And change the variable as well. And again, this is at the beginning of the game, all the values that are set. All right, so now let's think about after, let's simulate some player damage. And to make things easy for myself, I'm just going to copy what I have above. But before I copy it, like I said, we're saving an integer, so I need to make sure that I am adding a string to a string. So I'm going to convert these integers to strings by using the string function. Okay, str is the string function, just like the float and the int function converts data into float and int. This converts data into strings. So now I'm going to copy this and paste it at the bottom and make some changes to simulate player damage. To put some commas here instead of equal signs. So I'm going to have health equal 100, armor equal 75, and P shield equal 50. Now I'm going to run this. And here in the simulation, at the beginning of the game, everything is set to 100, and after we play some damage, we have the shield strength is 50, armor is 75, and health is 100. Okay guys, that's about it for this video. We covered a lot about variables in this video, and I can understand if you didn't understand everything as I was going through it, so feel free to watch this video again, rewind it, and pause it as much as you need to, or you can run it a bit slower. And I will see you guys in the next video where we will talk about expressions.